All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the most recent GIS Weekly series. My name is Veronica and I work at Global Integrity on behalf of GIS program. We've been putting on this series where we ask one of our 14 different research projects that fall under the program to come to us and talk a little bit about their work, their findings, any insights they've derived in the last 3 years of work. So today, I'm really pleased to introduce Professors Liz David-Barrett and Mihály Fazekas. They've been working on a project that uses big data to identify corruption risks or red flags in public procurement processes. It's a really interesting project, and they've worked with different stakeholders and different kinds of institutions, government, multilateral institutions, in order to carry out their work. Before I let Liz and Mihály take it away, I want to quickly run through the GIA's program and some of the core principles that underpin this particular research program. The founding principles of ACE, anti-corruption evidence, are that research should be problem-focused on anti-corruption and not just on the way that corruption can manifest or the damage that it incurs. Projects should be issue-driven and specific and not apply a prescriptive one-size-fits-all solution to corruption. It should address real-world priorities and incentives in very specific sectors. They should take into account political will and focus on politically viable reforms. And as has been very relevant in this project, research projects should try and measure the real impacts and effects of anti-corruption interventions, engaging policymakers and practitioners from nose to tail of the research process. This took on different shapes for different projects, but researchers were encouraged to engage partner governments, civil society actors in the research design, implementation, and uptake wherever possible. So Liz and Mihály are going to give a presentation, and then I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Paul Haywood, who will be moderating the subsequent discussion. Please feel free to write into the chat, raise your hand on Zoom, or notify me over chat if you'd like to speak, and we'll be able to turn the camera to you and you can ask your question in person. So Liz and Mihály, take it away.
Great, thanks very much, Veronica. So I'm going to start off presenting, and then Mihály's going to take over, and he's also going to do a live demo of one of our data analytics portals. As Veronica said, this is part of the anti-corruption evidence program, and the problem that we started with was thinking about corruption in public procurement. And this is a really important issue, partly because public procurement is such a big part of public spending. So it's around 30% of public spending in OECD countries, but can easily be 40 or 50% in developing countries. And it's also an area that's highly prone to corruption. So a lot of money, and a lot of that money going astray. And when that money goes astray, it is not only a waste of public money, but it's also often leading to unsafe or poor quality services. And it's also, of course, having an impact on the economy. It's undermining markets by sending a signal that you can only get these contracts if you've got connections, for example, or you're willing to pay bribes. And so that's undermining economic development. So there's a really big problem, I think a big rationale for trying to tackle it, but at the same time, it's really difficult to identify corruption in public procurement. And so what we did in the project is developed a red flags methodology, which we used to analyze procurement, looking at whole enormous data sets of public procurement data from countries and from donors. And the idea of the methodology is that we can, by looking at those really big data sets, understand the patterns, to understand how the procurement process is being manipulated, and also then to use that to be able to track the effectiveness of any interventions that are supposed to be curbing corruption by looking at essentially tracking those risks before and after the intervention. So to tell you a bit more about the methodology, it's theoretically grounded, so grounded in our latest thinking about where corruption risks are likely to occur in the process, where there is, for example, little competition, where there's high levels of discretion, And then we've got red flags that relate to different aspects of the procurement process and the actors. So there will be red flags that relate to the tendering process itself. So for example, if a tender is only advertised for a really short time, then that might be because some insiders have been given prior knowledge of the tender, but many others are excluded because they haven't got time to prepare a bid. So that would be an example of a corruption risk indicator or red flag in the tendering process. But we could also have red flags that are around the contracting body. So does it buy a large share of its procurement from a particular supplier, for example, or does it very often use quite closed non-competitive procedures? We can look at the suppliers themselves. Were they only set up a few months ago, just before the tender, or even a few days ago? Or are they registered in a secrecy haven where we can't find out who the real owner is? And also looking at political connections, is there any evidence that there is a political connection between the contracting body and the supplier? So we've developed the methodology, then test it and validate it using statistical models and checking it against proven cases of corruption. And it's also something that can be tailored to the needs of particular users. We've actually been really lucky to have 3 phases of ACE funding. So the project has been, dates back to more than 6 years ago. Initially, in the first round, we collected data about aid-funded procurement. This was partly because this was still fairly early days and there was not that much government data available on procurement, whereas some donors are quite good at keeping the data. And so we collected a huge database of aid-funded procurement. In the second phase, we moved into collecting national procurement data. So again, with a big span of countries, different income levels, we collected the procurement data, cleaned it and built these red flag indicators for all of those countries. And then in the third phase, we moved very much into the sort of impact side of this in terms of trying to spread the word about how to do this analysis of procurement, and actually working with regulators and with civil society actors to build portals which allow people to analyze the data themselves. So I'm just going to whiz through some key research findings before handing over to Michi to talk about the portals. So the first one to say is, looking at our aid data and World Bank data, we find that there is a clear correlation between 2 red flags. So if there is only one bidder for a tender, then that increases the likelihood that there is a cost overrun. So the costs that are predicted at the outset of the project are in fact going to be bigger by the end. So there's one of these overruns. We then looked at the impact of reform, a particular reform that the World Bank introduced in around 2003, 2004. This was a reform that increased oversight. So it was supposed to increase the costs of corruption, essentially. It also was supposed to increase competition and lower bidding costs. We found that the reform did seem to be effective in reducing the share of contracts that had only one bidder. And so that's a key risk factor, and hence the reform seemed to be reducing the risks of corruption. We also found that it decreased corruption risks least where state capacity was high. So if you already had a reasonably effective state, then it was less effective. If you had a less effective state, then it was more effective, which also makes sense. But we then were interested in exploring this common problem that we find as anti-corruption practitioners and researchers, that sometimes when you introduce an intervention in one area, you might just squeeze the corruption through to another area. And so we also looked at what happens to other red flags. And we found, sadly, that although we get that important positive effect in terms of reducing single bidding, there was also evidence of evasive tactics, which to some extent seemed to cancel out those positive direct effects. So we found that buyers were switching to using non-competitive procedure types more often. and also that the market share of foreign companies, which is usually a good signal for competition, dropped by 2 percentage points. So again, I think it's a disappointing result in terms of the reform, but it's also quite interesting in showing what you can do with this kind of data analytics by being able to have an overview of the whole system and see what's happening in different parts of it. And then finally, we have a new result here. Michi will have has a paper coming out on this, we hope, very soon. And this is looking at the impact of electoral pressures. So looking at World Bank funded contracts in the year before and after elections, and finding that this phenomenon of only having one bidder on a tender notably increases before elections. And indeed, most of that increasing risk is concentrated in the highly competitive elections. So again, a little bit of a perverse result in a way. Really competitive elections seem to increase the incentives to steal what you can while you can. Okay, so now Michi's going to take over.
Great, thanks a lot, Liz. So Liz very nicely introduced you to our problem definition, the data. We have the methodological approach and some of the more interesting findings we have had. But of course, what's unique about GIAs and many of the FCDOs related funding streams is that we were asked, and quite gladly looked at how we can put these findings, these methodologies, this data to use on the ground in various countries. Now, throughout the 3 phases, we have had different types of engagement, and our thinking about the right form of engagement quite a bit evolved. If you can look at the next slide, please. So in the phases the first phases 1 and 2, we started off, if you like, offline collaboration and spreading the word. It's in COVID times, it sounds odd, but we did have a lot of people in physical rooms and physical faces smiling and similar. So what we started to do is not just publish the data we have, which was really the starting point, but going one step beyond and organize hackathons with civil society, with maths and statistics students. We did partner with the African Data Initiative, and we, together with them, led by African developers, we developed a tool which is called R-Instat, which is a free statistical tool which actually has a procurement corruption module. That's pretty cool. So basically, we use the data which is downloadable from our websites and in a room set together with a bunch of interested civil society activists and students, what have you, and jointly analyze these data sets and did some data analytics and also Googled the companies, so on and so forth. So we did that in a couple of places like Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda. And I think overall it worked very well. Actually, R-Instat is also part of some curriculum at universities. So this has had its impact, but also its limitations, and limitations simply coming from having it offline. And hence in phase 3, on the next slide, you could see that we started to do something a little broader. We focused on 2 countries, Uganda and Jamaica. And we had established strong working relationships with government and civil society partners in these 2 countries. And we jointly developed and adopted an analytics portal, and then organized trainings, and we continue to do these trainings. Some of it actually recorded, so people can look at how they work. So I will show a demo of this tool, this analytics portal. And then after the demo, I will show you some other collaborations and other outreach activities that we have had. So I continue to drop links in the chat. Forgive me for that. We have quite a few online tools, so you can play around with them while I'm talking, and also hopefully after. Now, okay, so what is this? So Open Tender Uganda, just like Open Tender Jamaica, follows a European innovation, a European early, one of the first portals in procurement and data analytics, opentender.eu. And we used that template and adapted it to the local context, the data, the risk profiles, and a number of other things in Jamaica and Uganda. And basically, this Open Tender portal, so this Open Tender portal is organized around areas of analysis. So organized around themes different users might be interested. In particular, we have market analysis, so kind of understanding spending patterns and understanding market structure. Then we have transparency, and we also have integrity. So two key areas of themes for anti-corruption, and you can get the data search as well as download. So let me very quickly just look at market analysis as an entry point into the data. But before that, let me also mention that you can see that the data scope varies quite a bit over time, and we haven't been able to update the Ugandan portal in particular for some time. And we are proud of a little policy impact we have had, that finally the Ugandan government procurement portal actually started to publish structured data again a few weeks ago. So we are in the process of adding full 2020, full 2021, and early 2022 data. So this portal will look a lot more populated in a few weeks' time. So let me look at market analysis first, even if the data is not as complete as it gets. So you can look at sectors like construction work, and you can dig deeper, and it's a hierarchical market and product classification. So you can identify the different markets and products you are interested in. You can look at works for competent part construction and civil engineering work. It's a 3-digit code, so you're already the second layer of the classification. And for each of these identified markets, you can look at the overall procurement score, so transparency and integrity together, with higher scores meaning higher performance, lower scores meaning worse performance. You can look at subsectors. In this case, we have only two notable subsectors which are fairly similar to each other. And then you can look at the spending patterns over time, so the number of contracts, the value of these contracts. You can look at procedure types, quite simple. And then what starts to be interesting is that you can look at the main suppliers and buyers, both by number and volume of spending. And then you can also look at the geographical location of buyers, so where spending is happening. And then, just like for every aspect of this portal, we find it important that the data is traceable. So every aggregate information like total spending, or later you will see integrity score. So for every indicator, you can trace the data back to its individual contracts from which the data is being generated. Now, let's look at just one organization. I select the largest buyer in the construction sector in Uganda, which is the Uganda National Roads Authority. I clicked on that and I got to the profile of this organization. And again, we start off by seeing some high-level descriptive spending over time or spending by sector, but also like main suppliers. And then you can start analyzing the integrity profile or the performance, procurement performance of these organizations. I can select integrity indicators. And for each year, I see the selected authority, the Uganda National Roads Authority, and a selected benchmark comparison group average score, and in this case these are authorities which spend big time on construction sector, and you could see how it's slightly overperforms, so having higher integrity than other similar organizations. Can also look at transparency, where the performance is notably lower, even though it's still close to the benchmark group. And again, you get the full tenders backing all this up. I can add a number of background information, whatever is interesting for you. I think when we talk about integrity, what is very relevant is to look at the integrity indicator of individual tenders and contracts. So you can sort the contracts of the roads authority by integrity indicator. So I can literally look at a tender which was very low integrity, award the contract and the tender run by this authority, and then I jump to the page of that tender where you can see the integrity indicators, transparency indicator, and the components of that composite score. And again, you have a chance of benchmarking the tender itself. You can look at across sectors and years, or just look at an overall integrity comparison. And there is a great deal of detail about sources, about spending values, deadlines, so on and so forth. And the data is downloadable for individual records as well as for the full data set we have. Let me finish off by saying that we offer a complex search option, as well as you can enter the data not through the market analysis, but the integrity profile of the country, and then select entities following the integrity scores you are interested in. So let me stop the demonstration here and then just say that this is something which we worked out together with our users in and outside of government. And what is in front of us still, and this is a long road, is to make these kinds of tools, our tools, used in a day-to-day practice, both in and outside of government. So I switch back to presentation very quickly and introduce you to some additional tools we have developed. One is the Procurement Integrity or Proact portal, which we have developed together with the World Bank. And again, let me drop the link here and the chat. So this is a tool which is global in nature, so it has more than 100 countries in it, even though the data scope drastically differs country by country. For some countries, we only have data from the World Bank funded contracts. For others, we have millions of records from a national procurement system. Nevertheless, this is a unique tool, globally unique tool, that it allows you to look across countries in a single structure. So you can look at, say, healthcare providers across all of Sub-Saharan Africa or all of Eastern Europe, and you can look at their performance, compare them, download their data. So that's quite unique, I believe. And then the focus is also integrity and transparency in this portal, but the range of indicators is somewhat different because we wanted to have a range of indicators which are more or less comparable across countries. So really, you can make meaningful comparisons along the same dimensions across countries, across markets, across time. Jumping ahead very quickly, I dropped the last link, I promise. So this is a tool we developed together with the IMF and directly with FCDO. The UK's FCDO, and this is the corruption cost tracker tool, which is much simpler than the others, but its focus is also a lot clearer. Here, the focus is on the distribution of risks of corruption in public procurement, and importantly, the impact those risks have on overpricing, so what we call potential efficiency gains from eliminating corruption risks. So basically, we have a predictive model sitting behind this website, which really looks at how prices would or do vary with different types and amounts of red flags or corruption risk indicators. So you can look at different sectors or regions or even years as the potential efficiency gains vary across these dimensions. There is also something which is pretty new, and this is the first time we are doing it. Based on our predictive model, we allow policymakers to play around with policy scenarios. And playing around with policy scenarios means you can ask the question, what would happen if we lowered the composite corruption risk index by 30%? Or what would happen if there was no single bidding in our country? So every single tender would be de facto competed for. And based on our models, the dashboard allows you to see how much less you would pay at the point of contract award for the same amount and quality of goods and services. So that was basically the tour de table about our key outputs and how we engage with different local and global stakeholders. Just to quickly recap, we have a bunch of articles already published, some in the pipeline. We did an uncountable number of events in various places, and we have published all our data from the development aid contracts as well as national data sets. These are all downloadable as in a full, but also they are there on the analytics portal. You can play around with them and analyze them. And we have a commitment, which we will honor, to maintain these, right? So as we go forward, we will add new data, we will adapt our tools so that they remain useful for the coming years for stakeholders. So some key takeaways. So we do think that this nose to tail philosophy worked very well for us. I must admit it worked very well for us because we had a lot of time. So the three phases of the research overall amounted for more than 6 years. So we had sufficient time to play around with different approaches to the problem and methodology measurement, really talk to a lot of people, learn from them. So by the time we got to the tools development about 2 years ago, we had a pretty clear idea of what tools people would need for the different users, and hence we were fairly well placed to offer training and contribute to impact. I'm not saying we eliminated corruption in any of these places, but we do think that we contributed for better evidence base and better data for anti-corruption. Now, still, there are quite a few preconditions which we need for our approach. One is, of course, having the right data, digital data, which is of sufficient quality as well as scope, and that's a big topic we might want to talk about later. We also need friendly, easy to use tools to analyze the data. Just putting data out, even if it's a simple CSV or a more complicated JSON structure, people are not really using it. You know, it's for specialized people. We need tools, we need reports, we need training, an ecosystem of data access channels so that a wide set of actors use the data and the indicators in a regular fashion. And then we also need demand, right? We didn't have demand in every place where we had data. Yeah? So that's a very important point. Its data is great, and we should go to places where we can demonstrate the cool tools we develop, but we also need users who are genuinely interested in using data for anti-corruption, not just playing around with some fancy dashboard because everyone says yes to it, but really wanting to do something about corruption, and hence the data helping them to do it, right? So these are hard things, and I'm sure in the other GIA's presentations you have heard quite a bit about political economy and other assessments which help us understand where are those users, who are those users, who could make use of data analytics to foster anti-corruption. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Liz and Michi, as ever. You know, a fantastically clear and hugely impressive presentation, and I have to say, as director of the GIACE program, that it makes me proud to be associated with the work that you're doing. So very good. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but whilst people organize their thoughts and put their hands up and indicate that they have some questions, can I just kick off with one? You started out by saying that there was a clear association, and you showed a correlation between single bidders and cost overruns, and that, you know, that would make perfect sense. But we know that public procurement contracts are notoriously associated with cost overruns, and presumably cost overruns even in situations where there aren't just single bidders. So what I'd be interested in is whether you've done the research into what the difference is in terms of the extent of cost overrun from single bidder to non-single bidder, and whether, as a follow-up to that, there are actually any differences according to sector. It was great to see how your analytic portals were allowing you to go into different sectors. Does it vary? So if you're looking at construction as opposed to, say, IT supplies as opposed to other areas, do you get a difference in the extent of cost overrun? Are there some sectors which are much more prone to it than others? So those are the questions I'd like to hear your thoughts on, and I'll wait to see if anybody else comes in with a question. In the meantime, perhaps you would respond to that.
Liz, do you want to jump ahead, or should I?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, we do find bigger effect from single bidding on cost overruns. In terms of the sectoral breakdown, I don't think we did that, but Michi might have done that in something else.
Yeah, exactly. So the map Liz showed and the results are particular about World Bank funded public procurement. And I think the cleanest identification of this relationship comes from something which is standard, right? Not hugely complex, you know, you build in a once in a lifetime dam in an XYZ country, but, you know, things like ordinary purchases like buying cars or some, you know, standard machinery, so on and so forth. So in these cases, in these sectors, we find this relatively clear pattern. And in the analysis, we do control for sectors, so it's within sector comparisons. In terms of sector by sector analysis and the differences across sectors, so I think exactly there is this distinction when you look at high value construction, which is inherently very hard to plan appropriately. And when we look at corruption risks and cost overruns, we always say like a few percentage points of overrun is probably business as usual in a number of sectors. We start to be worried when prices double, when prices triple. And these are the exorbitant, really without control kind of overruns, which we see in very corrupt places, in very corrupt tenders. So that's the kind of the scale and the sectoral distribution. And I also want to add one more thing, Paul. I don't know if anyone is on this call have background in public administration, because if you look at the US literature, they would say cost overrun should be higher for more competitive tenders, so when single bidding is lower, right? That's what the economists call the winner's curse. So indeed, depending on the market, the strength of the competition, institutional quality, the relationship can be ambiguous, right? So deliberately, we didn't look at US federal government, which operates very differently, even though, you know, cost overrun is part of a corrupt scheme sometimes there as well. But by generally, the winner's curse is the opposite effect here.
Thanks very much. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. There's one from Gavin Heyman and one from Justin Snyder. I think since they're so clearly put in the chat, I'll just read them out. Have you any lessons. Gavin asks, have you any lessons so far on how to promote use and institutionalization and impacts from that? And then Justin asks, I'm curious about how you go about identifying political connections and potential conflicts of interest that may affect procurement integrity. And that's because he's developing a tool to explore that effect in Indonesia. So if you could respond to those two questions, that would be great.
Okay, so on use and institutionalization, I think probably the key takeaway for me is around having several different stakeholders involved. So in terms of our work developing the portals, I think it's really worked best where we've had government and civil society partners, as we have in Uganda. So both the Public Procurement and Disposal of Assets Authority and the Africa Freedom of Information Centre. And then it just sort of, keeps the process going, that they're working together, holding each other to account as well. And in more broadly than that, I would say having different bits of government involved is good. So in other work, we've found that if you can get the Ministry of Finance involved in this as an efficiency promoting tool, then that's also really helpful, so that it's not all on the kind of transparency, integrity side, which is something which is perhaps more prone to political risk. So that's, I think, one thing around that. In terms of institutionalization, I think it is really important that it gets built into mandates. So, for example, one of the reasons in Jamaica that they've been quite interested is that they had a new Integrity Act, which within it had a mandate around analysing data and benefiting from that. So, that's the kind of thing that helps you to sort of shoehorn it into something where you get resources and budget and staff allocated, rather than it just being a project that then no one's really got the time or the mandate to do. So that's probably my answer on that one. Mishy's probably better on the latest developments on political connections, but essentially some things we can look at potentially are around where we've got beneficial ownership data, then you can match that up with people who are on tender boards and that kind of thing. Potentially you can do work around matching up asset declarations with people who are involved in tendering processes or procurement, and trying to match that also to corporate performance. But I'll let Mishy come in on those as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Liz. Just adding to your first point a little bit. So institutionalization is a critical and difficult bit, because now we are at the stage there is enough excitement, and I'm sure, Gavin, you know this as well, that people get on board a workshop, they like a demo tool, but really the challenge we have is to get embedded in day-to-day practice. And bureaucracies are bureaucracies. They have distinct tasks, distinct outputs, and limited budgets. So really, you have to hold onto or hook onto distinct tasks. You have to produce a report every quarter, or you have to identify investigative priorities. You have to make sure that the legal mandate and the business process within government is made more efficient by the data, right? So we need to demonstrate that we add value. It's, like some actor who is interested in fighting corruption will, look at the portal, but then that's it. Unless you see, okay, for this kind of activity I have to do regularly, this helps me. So this is where we are going now to make the tools specific enough and useful enough to the particular people in government who could benefit, whose work becomes more efficient. And then they use it, then they want it, then they allocate budgets to it. So I think that last mile is quite challenging, because you have to find the specific use cases, if you like. But this is what we are learning more and more these days. On the conflict of interest and networks and all that. So exactly, that's as Liz said, it's driven by the data, and it's a lot more tricky than procurement, because politicians don't like to put out in their asset declarations that they have a firm funded in, registered in the Cayman Islands, and then they win contracts in XYZ country through that, right? The very reason that they use these evasive techniques is that no one wants to see them. So usually pure automated methods are very limited. I know people believe in beneficial ownership registers, but I don't expect the corrupt to put their own name on the contracts, right? I mean, that would be very stupid of them. So really what you need to do is, of course, get the data where you can, and maybe there are some, fairly incompetent corrupt you will catch. And you have to do the heavy investigative work to map these networks manually and then plug them back into the data. We are doing it in a couple of places, like we have a big project in Bulgaria where we really go after each oligarch and their families, and it's months and months of investigative work to get the connections mapped, and then we map it back to the procurement data. But they don't put it in the declaration. So unfortunately, these automated approaches have their limitations, I think.
Thanks, Mishi and Liz and Justin clearly approved of some of those comments, judging from the clapping hands. So I have another question now from Stephen Tosh. How do you reduce the false positives within corruption indicators? Specifically, a single tender response might just be that only one company is interested in the contract or the project, or presumably by the same token, you could have very highly specialized areas where there are only certain companies that can bid. And we also have a question from Bonnie. So I'm going to hand over to Bonnie to ask that question directly.
I'll go now. So I'm looking at the Procurement Integrity website, and I'm curious about whether you can either tell us more about the methodology you use to generate the transparency and integrity indicators, or at least point us in the direction where you've written up that methodology, please.
Okay, so I'll kick off with Stephen's question. So essentially, we can't reduce false positives, but we do stress that these are corruption risk indicators rather than corruption indicators. So essentially the beauty of looking at a really big data set is that you can spot these patterns, but we're not saying that if you see even a particular tender that comes out as very low integrity or very high risk, we're not saying that that's necessarily corrupt. It's more a way of being able to identify what tenders you might want to then go and dig into and research and investigate further, and also spotting patterns. So you might spot that a particular buyer seems to have a very frequent relationship with a particular supplier, or something like that. You might spot that a particular buyer seems to have a pattern of using non-competitive procedures. So so we have to be quite careful, I think, about saying that this is in a way a first step rather than that, because you're absolutely right that there could be legitimate reasons in an individual case for only having one bidder, for example.
Yeah, and building on this, so as Liz said, we cannot eliminate false positives. That's an approximation of corruption risk. That's a probabilistic approach. But we can lower the rate of false positives through a number of approaches. One of the approaches is to eliminate alternative or weaken alternative explanations. So that's, for example, excluding markets which are by nature non-competitive, right? It's not in the portal, right? We allow people to play around with the full data, but in academic papers, we always start off by saying, look, all those markets where we don't have enough unique suppliers, like 3 or 5 or 10 in a certain period, we say, okay, the market structure looks like it's non-competitive. We remove that. So the arguments of corruption being associated with the deliberate limitation on competition only hold in cases where in the absence of corruption, you would get competition. So we try to identify these markets, and for most of the data sets we have, this is 95% of the data. So quantitatively, most markets we look at that by nature competitive, because most of procurement is about school meals, fuel for cars for the ministry, these things. So that's one way of eliminating or lowering false positive rates. The second one is triangulating different indicators. So we use a lot single bidding because it's easy to communicate, but we never said that that's the indicator, and it shouldn't be. The idea is to look at a range of indicators, ideally tracking risks all across the full cycle. So from tender announcement to contract completion. And if you look at risk patterns across the whole cycle, and then all the risk factors point at the same direction, then your likelihood of false alarm or false positive is much lower, right? So triangulating across different indicators, so single bidding, then tax haven registered companies, so on and so forth, together again lowers false positive rates. So that's a couple of techniques here, and we cannot eliminate all false positives, but you can lower those rates a little bit. And then on Bonnie's question, so we have written about both the transparency indicators and the corruption risk indicators, and this published research, and on the procurement integrity portal with the World Bank, but also on the European open tender portals. That's we follow the same methodology of validating indicators, both internal and external validity. If I mention external validity example, they should predict higher prices. If they don't predict higher prices, they're unlikely to be corruption risk indicators. So we pass through all indicators a series of validity tests, and once they pass, they go onto the portal, right? So that's very different from most purely civil society-driven projects or portals. We do the research first, and then we put the data on the portals, right? So I will drop here 2 links in the chat where you could see some of the published material on that, but for the Proact portal has an about page, so we have a lot more citations there.
Thanks very much. We have a question from Carlos Barbosa.
Hi everyone. Hi Liz. My question is actually on the governance side of it, because I see a very similar methodology for banks. For instance, you have like lots of red flags before a transaction. The transaction sounds suspicious, you block it right away. And it sounds to me that this methodology also allows us to think on the procurement, during the procurement, as long as the red flags comes in, should be like a threshold and said, oh, okay, hold on, let's investigate before the procurement ends up. Because once you get it done, once they start doing the business, it's even harder to stop. To maybe there is a job being done anyway, but not in the best price possible, or delivering the job, but with corruption as well. So my point is, when to make sure that the threshold is just not another bureaucracy. Coming from Brazil and speaking from the Brazilian side, we have a very sound procurement system, but it's so hard to understand. There is so much data, there is so much bureaucracy on it, that it's quite hard to see when the red flag is enough and who to call anyway. So there is this two sides, when to pull it off and who to call anyway. It's the ombudsman, it's I don't know, who to call anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, I think these are really good points, because, as Michi said, it's not just even about having the right data and being able to construct the indicators, but it's so important to have people who are able to work out what's going on with that, and then also you need someone to report it to who's then going to use it and act on it. So there are a lot of pieces of the governance puzzle, I think, that need to be in place for this to actually improve accountability. Where I thought you were going with that actually was around sort of doing real-time tracking. And of course, that's something that becomes possible, again, depending on quality of data, but potentially becomes possible if you've got really comprehensive e-procurement. and you've got a lot of things that you can monitor as they're going, and then you've got the potential to intervene. Although there's also always a risk that then that is used mischievously to, to say that there's a problem and to block someone and delay a tendering process. So this is all pretty fraught with difficulties, I think. But overall, I would absolutely agree that you need that governance in place to be able to act and respond and work out what's going on.
Yeah, and I think this question goes into this difficulty of finding whom to call, who is the actor. And for example, with the Procurement Integrity Portal, what we are working on right now is talking to a series of procurement specialists at the World Bank, who, like in Brazilian government, they list a litany of things to check. Yeah, so they are not looking for more tick boxes. But when you say that, look, you have to check prior experience and you have crappy data on it, crappy meaning companies self-declared. I mean, you build a bridge, it collapsed months later, you don't put it on your CV as a company, right? So basically telling these people that the things you have to do and you are frustrated by you cannot do well, here is a data tool which helps you do that quicker, more comprehensively, more reliably. Of course, I'm overstating how good our data is because there are a lot of gaps, but that's the direction, right? So our kind of selling point is that the research and the data helps you make a business process better. And then you know whom to call, because you have to make that call. Is this the company we should award the contract to or not? And then now you have a tool which helps you better investigate, better make that call. And then going back to the point what Liz mentioned, these are risk indicators. These are data sets which have their own noisy and other gaps. So it helps you get an additional insight. And if you see reasons for worry, or you think that, look, this company submitted a beautiful set of projects, but I have 10 other projects in the database and they all look like terminated early, then you dig deeper, right? So I think that's what we want to do to help these checks run better. I'm not a big fan of predictive analytics in this field because I don't want companies to be disadvantaged in the process because they might do something in the future because some AI predicted it. I think it's illegal and it's wrong, but looking at past performance, look, you did these bad things, so we ask extra questions from you because you defaulted on 2 of your 5 last projects. That's a sensible approach, and data can help you with that. And organizations like the World Bank have the mandate to do this, to make these calls. Do we impose additional auditing clauses on you because you have a certain risk level, or you let you run with the money because we trust you a lot, right? If this decision is made better because of data, I think we reached quite a bit of the goals we set out to reach.
That's great. So can I just ask a quick question, which I suspect may be the last one because we're coming up to our deadline, and it's to ask you a bit about your data sources, because obviously, I've heard you give previous presentations in which one of the things that you've always stressed is the variability in the quality of the data that you can get access to, and you've shown some surprising indicators how some of the countries that we might expect to have some of the best data in fact don't have particularly good data. So are you able to give an indication as to whether, given that there has been such a push towards data transparency, open data, lots of initiatives in that field, are you spotting a trend towards better data over time? Or is there nothing that you can say in regard to that things are just as they always have been? Or is it even potentially getting worse? I'd be really interested to hear how you're finding access to data.
Michi, I think you should take that.
Okay, look, I mean, I had a chat, I think 10 years ago from a policy analyst from the European Commission and told me like, look, you invest all these resources into scraping this data and collecting it and standardizing it. It's not worth it. The future is open data, structured data, all governments will do it. Why do you spend years on doing it? I said, okay, let's see. And 10 years later, we still struggle. And I don't see a clear pattern in spite of, I'm very glad for OCP pushing governments to put out structured data. And I don't see a clear trajectory, because once governments realize that this data is real, it can be used to hurt them in election campaigns, investigations, what have you, suddenly transparency is no longer interesting for them. Yeah, so I've seen countries like federal government of India introducing CAPTCHA. We did collect Indian procurement data. It's impossible to collect it now because they protect it. Same goes for Turkey, it's protected by CAPTCHA. The Ugandan government had the data download function for a long time turned off. Gladly, it's turned back again. So there are a lot of back and forths, but there's no a single trajectory to more openness. And I think transparency is cheap as long as it's not really, hurting you as a corrupt leader. And once it starts to hurt you, you realize, well, I'm controlling data. And that's where the coalitions Liz mentioned, talked about, and the institutionalization Gavin asked about becomes very important. We want more transparency, but I want it to stay once it has a teeth. And for that, we need coalitions, we need laws, we need institutions to protect transparency, because there is quick backtracking once the power of data is shown.
Yeah, thanks. Kind of, as I might have expected, even if a bit depressing as a response, and all ties in a little bit to your kind of whack-a-mole observations in the past. So we're at just about at time. If are there any other last questions? I think we've just got time for one last question if anybody has one. So I'll just pause a second. But if not,
Can I cheekily chime in? Like Zoom bombing?
Yeah, of course you can.
OCP. Just pushing back a tiny bit on Mihi's final conclusion on the data. I think if the data is part of a systemic change process and leads to fundamentally better outcomes for enough people that it can overpower the best interests of blockchain, then things happen. I think that's the design we want to get to. So if by virtue of doing that, I think in countries like Ukraine, where something like 90+% of contracts now go to small businesses, and they have a lot of stake in protecting the system from changes, that's very powerful. So I think that issue you always touch on, of course, with the ACE work of incentives, right, to use the data and create real change in agency really matters. If it's just like a sort of, let's say, a thin OGP commitment to a bit more data that isn't really protected or connected to political change and a change in power, then it's very vulnerable. I think that's more the conclusion I would draw from what the research has shown us so far.
Yeah, exactly. And just building on this, I think even countries which think they got it sorted, like the UK, look at how there is backtracking, like the VIP lane. You try not to put it out, right? So there are constant pressures for trying to take things out from the transparent part, because the pressures for, you can claim efficiency, I would think potential favoritism, right? So I think this is a sort of balance. You always have to push back and push for more transparency. Otherwise, it's not like once you reach it, you got it, right? Ukraine will have the next battleground in 5 years, right? There will be a new leader who will try to push it back, and then we have to watch, right? That's the.
We've had about 4 pushbacks already, so yeah, it totally goes on. It's always, yeah, because you're talking about real money and real power, so you get right to the heart of conflict of interest. But yeah, that building those sufficient coalitions of change, the Mustak Khan thesis of like more incentives to win and do the right thing. That's the challenge. That's the game, I guess.
Well, thanks, Gavin, and let's hope that the next leader of Ukraine's name is not Putin. So thanks again for the superb presentation. Thanks everybody for the questions. Really interesting discussion, and look forward to seeing all of you at our next event, which you can find the details of in the chat and on the website. So thank you very much.